Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are back. We are back with some League of Legends off-season content here. 2022 is done. 2023 is approaching fast, and it is time to talk about some of the changes that have happened over the course of the off-season. Of course, I've taken a little bit of a break after the World Championships. This is my first video, a little over a month after the end of the World Championships. I appreciate you guys being a little bit patient with me through that time. Obviously, as all of you know, this is not my full-time job. I make this content as a huge hobby of mine because I love the scene, I love League of Legends, I love esports, and I love talking about it here on the channel. So after Worlds was done, had to bunker down a little bit in terms of the content, kind of refresh a bit, but we're coming back now with some awesome off-season content, and man, am I excited to talk about it. In this video here today, we're going to be doing something that we have done in the past here on this channel, and longtime fans will know that. We're going to be going over all 10 LCS teams and organizations, talking about what they had last year and what they changed that out for now going into 2023 this upcoming year, and whether I think that was a positive, a negative, or a neutral change, and whether or not generally I think the organization is going in the right direction. I do want to make a little bit of a disclaimer. This is not a power rankings video. I am going to be doing a power rankings video for the 4 major regions before the season starts, but those are going to be a little bit more in-depth. These videos are more going to be to explain where I think the direction of the organizations are heading. Do I think they made good moves, whether or not that's going to show on the Rift or not, I guess? Or do I think that they're moving backwards? Do I think that really a lot of the moves that they made could definitely be called into question? I think there's a little bit of both in the LCS and in the entire world this year. So if you're looking forward to that, let me know down in the comments section below. What team upgraded the most in your eyes in the LCS this offseason, and what team downgraded the most in your eyes this LCS offseason? I'd love to hear you guys' opinions. We've been seeing a ton online through a lot of different content creators and just Twitter in general, and I'm kind of interested to know what you guys as viewers of the channel may view as some of the biggest upgrades and downgrades, because I'll let you know as we go throughout this video, there might be some surprises in terms of where I'm high and where I'm low on some players. But with all that intro out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the video. We're going to be going over every single team, and we're going to be doing it in reverse order, or I guess order, whatever you want to call it, from how they finished in the summer split of 2022. So we're going to be talking about the best teams first and the worst teams last in terms of 2022 performance, which means we're going to be starting with our 2022 Summer LCS champions, and that is, of course, Cloud9. Now, Cloud9, definitely an interesting one to talk about to start here. First of all, I should explain what's going to be up on your screen right now. If you are looking at the visuals, of course, you're going to be seeing the roster. On the left is going to be the 2022 roster for the team. On the right is going to be the 2023 roster for the team. And of course, in the middle, it will have a variety of things. There are 4 possible things you're going to be seeing in the middle. The first one, which you are seeing quite a bit on this page, is no change. That means there is no change from the player last year to this year. They have carried over in that role. You can also see 3 ratings in terms of changed players in the middle, which is, of course, upgraded, downgraded, or just changed. Now, I'll get into a little bit of that now. Of course, an upgrade would be someone that I think actively improves the team right now by a considerable margin. A downgrade does the opposite. It actively makes the team a little bit worse and is oftentimes a little bit either of a head-scratching decision or a concession that a team had to make for a good player leaving. And then there's the neutral one, change. This can mean one of 2 things. Either I think it could be an upgrade right now, but potentially losing out on some long-term stability or just some general team cohesion in terms of playstyle. Or alternatively, it could be something that maybe downgrades your team in the moment, but has potential to be an upgrade over the course of the year if things were to gel. And of course, in those cases, I will get to them individually. But let's go ahead and talk about Cloud9 right now. We're going to start with all of the unchanged players first because they're easier to talk about. And for Cloud9, that's most of the roster. They're keeping 4 of the 5 members of this team that just won the LCS. I certainly can't be mad at that decision. I think continuing on with a core that definitely showed growth throughout the year is a great decision, only really changing out a veteran member for a young mid laner that does show a little bit of promise, and we're going to get into that in a bit. But talking about who is staying, Fudge staying in the top lane, he really improved towards the back half of the split. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are going to point to the World's performance not really being up to snuff. And yes, while that was the case, typically, and this is something that you're going to see throughout the entirety of this list for me, I value the entire split's worth of tape over just one tournament's performance, right? If I see somebody who played really, really well all year long and just wasn't able to be perfect at the World Championships, I'm probably still going to be at least a little bit optimistic that the 1 or 2 weeks that they spent in one location for one tournament isn't the end-all be-all for their performance. We'll get into some of those players later. Fudge is definitely one of them, though. I'm definitely still high on Fudge. Oh, I should also note, I can't believe I didn't bring this up until 5 minutes into the video here, but below all the players' names, you are going to see a grade. Now, I want to make this abundantly clear because I've gotten in a lot of heat in the past for some of these grades, and I know I definitely go out on a limb with some of these grades, but what these grades are essentially supposed to represent is, in my opinion, what the value of that player is to teams in the region. So that doesn't always necessarily correlate to a player being better. A player can have a higher value score and be a worse player than someone else. It's just what I think teams around the league are valuing them as, and definitely something I want to talk about. For Fudge, I think he's still a really strong asset. I'll talk about this now. A assets, anything in the A range is superstar, top of the region, very strong asset. A top team would want that player pretty much no matter what. A B asset, B plus to B minus, anywhere in between, right? That's going to be a very good asset, something that you are definitely not worried about starting in the LCS especially, but something you're really not worried about feeling like you have to upgrade. Not going to be a weakness for your team, but not like the best players in the region, right? I think Fudge is a great example. You see Sven fall into that category. Jensen's another player that falls into that category. Very solid players, but none that are going to like single-handedly carry your team to top-level performances. And then you've got C. Cs are, you know, good players. C pluses especially, typically lower caliber starting players. Anything below that, C, C minus, probably going to be more of a backup type, a backup caliber player, or a strong backup, I should say. A kind of a weaker starter. We'll get into some of those. Obviously, some of the top teams just don't have those. And then anything D or in the D category is just what I call like tainted assets or unreliable assets. Players that have definitely had their values disproportionately shifted because of some play in recent years. Now, we only have a couple of cases of that in the entire world right now, but we'll get into those when we get into those. So, Fudge coming in at a B plus asset. This is somebody who I think could realistically turn into an A asset throughout the year. This is someone who is very, 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 very strong in the top lane when he's able to get his matchups, when he's able to outskill his opponent, but as we know, he sometimes does struggle with taking the concession lanes, the tank lanes, and so if he's able to, I think, you know, continue on that trend, maybe just kind of up his game in terms of being able to carry from that top side, especially if top lane is going to be a little bit more of a carry role in this upcoming year, then I think Fudge definitely has the potential to be in that A range, but I think B plus is pretty good for him right now. I do have Blabber here in the A range, obviously unchanged and incredibly talented jungler. I got in a lot of heat in past years in videos like this for having Blabber as one of the highest rated and highest valued players in the league, but you just don't find players like Blabber all that often. He is a player that can single-handedly win you games basically by himself from the jungle position. Even in the first 5 to 6 minutes of the game, he can generate leads that are so disproportionate to what basically anybody else in the league can do that you're often relying on him. He's been very clutch in the LCS playoffs. I know there's been a lot of talk about his Worlds performances, even though I don't remember a Worlds in which he was like obscenely bad other than that first one in which he was a backup anyways, and so really, I'm not so sure about like the Blabber choke artist narrative. He clearly disproved that in the playoffs this past year, and he continues to grow. Obviously, he's also endemic. He's a North American player. He's not an import, and that is going to raise your value. I will talk about that a bit, but imports are often going to have lower value just in general because if you have a player of equal value, one of them's an import and one of them's not, the non-import is more valuable. They just always are, and so Blabber's value does go up a bit by the fact of him not being an import as well. Him being as good as he is, arguably the best jungler in the region, and being a North American talent, I think is huge, huge for Cloud9. Of course, Berserker's going to come in at an A as well. I kind of played around with him at an A-. I do like him at the A here, though, just because I think you can make a real case that Berserker is the most talented prospect in the entire LCS. I think that any team in the league would die to have him, even though he is an import. I think it's enough to keep him at the A spot because he really did show a lot of growth. He was great in the playoffs. Obviously, when the meta was conducive to him being able to carry games, obviously Zeri being in meta, Sivir being in meta, Berserker was incredibly strong in metas like that. Now, it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be able to adapt to a more widespread meta. He wasn't perfect at Worlds. But I still think he's got the talent. I mean, if we're talking about Berserker as the best player in the LCS by year's end, I'm not going to be surprised even a little bit. And then Sven comes in at a B. I do think he's probably, kind of the lowest of the assets that are returning. He was fine last year, showed a lot of proficiency on enchanters specifically, but definitely something I'm a little bit interested to see if he continues to grow as a support or if this is more for synergy with Berserker. I was really kind of interested to see if Sven was going to go back to AD carry this offseason. He decides to re-up with Cloud9 and stay on to play with Berserker. I still think he's fine. It certainly isn't like a big wow return for me. Not to say that Sven's a bad player, and obviously he offers a lot more than what his gameplay is, but he's fine. He's certainly not someone that is going to drag your team down. That's why the B grade is there. Now, your one big change for Cloud9 is going to be in the mid lane here. You had Jensen, obviously a big veteran presence you brought in the summer of last year. He really upped the ante for this team. He really unlocked the playstyle that they wanted to go with. Played a lot more of these enablers, these kind of more supportive mid laners, things like the Zillion, things like the Anivia towards the back half of the year, the Orianna comes to mind as well to enable players like Blabber to be able to take over the game a tad bit more. You're actually transitioning out of that and moving into Diplex, who's coming in from Vitality B here, and this is going to be maybe one of my more controversial opinions. I see a lot of hype for Jensen online right now, but Diplex, in my opinion, is at worst a change. I think this is a really smart move from Cloud9, seeing a player in Jensen who does have value, and really saying we can get that, but for a little bit cheaper. And really, I imagine that's what happened here with Diplex, is he was just a much cheaper version of what essentially you were going to be getting with Jensen in the first place. And I really like Diplex as a player. I don't think he's this phenomenal, unbeatable prospect. He's not Takuya coming in last year, who I thought was unbelievable, a great signing for FlyQuest, and that really turned out great. I think Diplex is a good player that really can prove to mesh with this team. It's just going to be about whether or not he does it, right? Whether or not he actually performs on some of that promise. Cloud9, in general, has a fantastic track record of taking players like this and making them work out in their scheme. I'm not really worried at all about Diplex. He's a little bit more of an aggressive player than someone like Jensen. Certainly going to be maybe slightly less willing to take a backseat, but it's not like he doesn't play control mages. It's not like he's not going to be willing to help Blabber out. I think this team is going to function very similarly to what they did last year, and that's certainly not a bad thing at all. I think this team is still going to run through Blabber and Berserker. Those are going to be your two main carries. Fudge is definitely going to be able to try to get that counter pick in the top lane, and Diplex and Sven are going to be there to try and enable everything else. I don't think the core identity of this changes. Do I think Cloud9 moved in a good direction this offseason? In my opinion, yes. I like the fact that you brought back 4 members from your championship winning team. Cohesion is incredibly important in League of Legends. Having time to develop that synergy with other players on the Rift is huge, 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 and Cloud9 doing that over the course of the year I think is going to be very big for them. Diplex I think slots in really, really well. Even if I do have him at a B- grade, which is slightly lower than Jensen, most of that is purely just because he is an import, whereas Jensen is not at this point. And so, for the most part, I see Diplex as a plug-and-play replacement. I think he's probably going to be just as good as Jensen was going into this year. I know that's going to surprise a lot of people, but I really have a lot of faith that this Cloud9 team knows where they're going. They get a little bit more upside in that mid lane for really not that much of a cost of direct talent at the moment, and this organization just does this over and over again. They retool and they refire every single year. I think this year is going to be no different. Moving from a team that made basically no changes in the offseason, really trying to retain their core and push forward, to a team that made a bunch of splash moves this offseason, the runners-up of 2022 summer in the LCS, we have 100 Thieves. Now, this is a roster I've been excited to talk about. Of course, in 2022, they ran out Someday, Closer, Abadage, FBI, and Huhi, but in 2023, they're going to be running out Tenacity in the top lane, Closer in the jungle, Bjergsen in the mid lane, double-lifted AD carry, and Busio at support. A lot of really, really interesting pieces to talk about here. Let's start with Closer, because he is the one that is returning from last year. I think Closer being the one that you keep from this roster is a pretty good choice. Not the choice I would have made, but, with a lot of the other pieces that you could have acquired, I think Closer was probably the right choice. You made a lot of good strides to develop Closer into what he really has become. He was great in Golden Guardians, of course, but he really, launched into his own on 100 Thieves and really became one of those carry junglers. I think he's the kind of player that can really fit on a team that has a lot of, strong personalities like this one will have. I think he's a player that isn't going to be afraid to speak his mind, isn't going to be afraid to take resources from a player like Bjergsen, who is going to be a little bit more passive as a mid laner. It's something we criticize him for a ton. I think Closer is a great jungler to be able to pair with someone like Bjergsen who can really help kind of push that pace forward and really accelerate the game a lot. And on top of that, I just think he's ridiculously talented, right? Like, I think last year was probably a down year for him, and I think at worst, he was a top 4 jungler in the league. I think that will continue over the course of this year, even if that B+ grade is maybe a little bit low. I know a lot of people are going to say he's an A asset. I don't quite see him like that. He's a very, very good player, but someone who still does show a little bit of inconsistency, especially over the course of an entire season, and that's going to hurt you. He was fine in the playoffs, but he wasn't this generational dominant, jungle talent. B+ coming in here, it feels pretty solid. He's a strong player that has the potential to be an A, value player pretty much any game that he plays, but it's just not going to be there over the course of an entire season. Maybe if he does put together another season kind of similar to his 2021, we can have that, but over the course of 2022, he just wasn't quite there. So he's going to stick at a B+ for me, but again, no complaints at all keeping closer on this 100 Thieves team. Let's go ahead and talk about the big elephants in the room first, shall we? Let's talk about Bjergsen and Doublelift joining 100 Thieves here. The Prodigal Duo returns together. The last time, of course, that they were together, they won 2020 Summer on TSM. Doublelift goes ahead and retires. Bjergsen goes over to a coach, and then obviously to Team Liquid, and yada, yada, yada. This is where I think I'm going to get some of my contentious opinions out here. Let's talk about Bjergsen first. I think Bjergsen is a pretty clear upgrade to Abadage, in my opinion. This is a very big add. Abadage, I think a lot of people forget, was not good over the course of most of last year. He definitely turned it up a bit for the playoffs, but him turning it up got him from like a C+ to a B- in terms of my value. He was really not good for most of the year last year, in my opinion. Again, had a much better second half of the split, but, and again, good playoffs, but Abadage showed a lot of flaws. He was very, very champion dependent, someone who I think was really, really concerning on these more supportive macro picks, someone that really wanted to be able to get ahead in lane, and when he couldn't do that, he really wasn't able to take over games in the same way that a lot of his other peers were. And I know I'm a bit lower on Abadage in terms of my opinion than public opinion, and that definitely rings true for both of these players, as I'm a little bit higher on Bjergsen than I think public opinion is at right now. You're going to see 8,000 Bjergsen slander accounts over the course of the next couple hours in my comment section, because I get them every single time I talk about Bjergsen. I don't really understand why people think he was so bad last year. I watched all the games again in preparation for this video. Not every single one, but a lot of the big games. I try to get every single team in. And man, he just plays exactly like he's supposed to all the time. He is everywhere he needs to be. He is never making mistakes. He is always pushing his team forward, and yet you see all these accusations of him being too passive, him playing too safe all the time, him not pushing his advantage enough. It's very difficult for him to push his advantage when oftentimes he's on these more scaling picks. It's really just kind of a general team composition thing rather than a Bjergsen thing. I'm tired of hearing that Bjergsen's not a player that can carry games. He's an A-, in my opinion. Still one of the single best assets in the entire league, and I think you could make a real case that he is the best mid lane asset outside of some imports that we have coming in, and I think, Bjergsen being a North American resident definitely helps his value, but to me, this is pretty no question an upgrade for 100 Thieves. I think going from Abadage to Bjergsen is a very big step up in consistency over the course of not only the year, but in the playoffs as well. Bjergsen's big problem over the course of the last year was the fact that his teammates really weren't living up to their expectations. He had a lot of problems being able to win games in the late game on champions like Swain that he was able to pull out relatively consistently, mostly because Swain's just not a champion that's designed for something like that. Obviously it wasn't just Swain, but champions in that similar vein, they're just not designed to be able to hard carry and dominate. When he was put on things like the Akali, on things like the LeBlanc, he showed that he is still Bjergsen, and he's still able to carry games relatively easily, and I think he's going to be able to show that a lot more on this 100 Thieves roster, or at least I would hope so. But that does move us into the bot lane role, which is definitely going to be a little bit contentious, because I have FBI to Doublelift being a downgrade, and I don't think this is controversial in any way. I'm sure that there's going to be a ton of Doublelift stan accounts in the comments that are outraged by this. As much as there are people that hate Bjergsen, there are a ton of people that love Doublelift, but let's go ahead and think back to what Doublelift was the last time he was in the league. Not only that, but let's think about where Doublelift is now going back into pro play. First of all, we know what he's been doing over the past year because he's one of the most successful streamers on the planet, and that's not a problem. I definitely don't hate him for that. He's a great streamer, but he hasn't been playing League of Legends all that seriously, and, obviously you can pick the game back up and still be good, but it's definitely a little bit of a concern, especially towards the beginning part of the year. But let's even think back to the last time he was playing the game professionally and playing it seriously. He got absolutely bodied by this exact bot lane that he's replacing on Golden Guardians in the playoffs. It was something that really pushed him over the edge in realizing that he didn't want to keep playing pro, that he did want to retire. He really couldn't keep up with a lot of the new talent coming into the league, which was FBI and Huhi at the time. FBI is certainly not coming off of a terrible year. I have him as a B+ asset, doesn't cost an import slot, and was incredibly consistent over the course of the regular season. People are going to talk about his Worlds performance. This is another one of those examples of me saying, okay, yeah, he had one really bad week in North America, in New York, at Worlds. I'm going to take 2 to 3 years worth of tape over that 1 week. I understand that there is implications that Worlds is, the games are more important and you have to be able to perform on that stage. But I think we've seen pretty much unanimously over the past few years that Worlds performance does not correlate to future success. It is something that, yes, it can be incredibly important at the time, but it's not an indicator. Like, paying people who do well at Worlds only to hope that they perform like that instead of like they performed the entire career usually doesn't quite work out for you, and the opposite rings true as well. People that don't perform at Worlds but do perform domestically often will continue to perform domestically. So FBI getting, kind of ousted here, I do think is a downgrade for 100 Thieves. Doublelift is going to come in and almost certainly be a major downgrade at first. Now, can he grow into being a lot more stable in that bot side? Yes, but I think a big part of whether 100 Thieves is successful this year is going to be whether or not Doublelift is going to be willing to take a more passive kind of weak side role. I think there's a lot of really strong players on this 100 Thieves team. I think Doublelift is probably the weakest, and I think if he buys into that role and plays a little bit more on that passive weak side bot lane, really allows some of these young guns to flex their muscles that they've been dominating on in Academy for a long time, I think he could be a pretty solid AD carry. It's just very difficult for me to predict him to be one of the top AD carries in the league when, first of all, he hasn't played the game all that regularly in a year, and second off, the last time he was in pro, he was average. He was a mid-tier AD carry at best. And so definitely things to consider. But then we've got the top and the support to talk about here. Tenacity and Busio, I'm going to kind of talk about them at the same time, I guess. I'll talk about Tenacity first. You're going from Someday to Tenacity. I have this listed as a change, even though you're going from an A grade in Someday to a B grade in Tenacity. I do think Tenacity will be worse from moment one. Someday is the best top laner in the region. I really don't even think that's all that much up for debate. He was very close to getting my vote for MVP last year. And moving from him to basically anybody else is always going to be a little bit of a transition, but it's only going to be listed as a change because Tenacity is definitely one of those players that in a year's time could be just as good, if not better, than Someday. He could be the best top laner in the league by the end of the year, even if he isn't right now. That B grade is probably a little modest. You'll notice a lot of the rookies coming in have, B, B minus, B plus, somewhere in that range grade. It's just hard for me to give someone an A grade that has never played in the LCS before, or at least played consistently in the LCS, as we'll get to with some players later. But Tenacity is definitely one of those players that it's hard for me to call this a downgrade, even though you're losing the best top laner in the region, because you're moving in a direction that gives you much more long-term stability, which I think is generally always a good idea, and I'm always going to push front offices to do that. If you don't want to pay a player like Someday premium money, which I'm sure he's making, you can probably get Tenacity in that starting lineup. He's going to be able to offer you quite a bit of what Someday offered, especially the aggression parts. He's a much more aggressive player than Someday was on the top side, without offering you that financial instability, and he could potentially grow into a player that is just as good in the long run. Fostering and developing NA talent has always been a priority for 100 Thieves, and I think that shows through in the top lane here. So excited about Tenacity, really interested to see if he's going to be getting a lot of pressure on the top side, because you look at the way that this roster is constructed, Doublelift might be playing more of a weak side role. Bjergsen's certainly not a strong side or, a heavy resource mid laner. Tenacity and Closer I could definitely see being the two players that get a lot invested into them on this team, and that would definitely accelerate, I think, where Tenacity is going. You also do have the support change here. You're going from Huhi to Busio. I think Huhi being rated a B is probably a little bit harsh, I guess is the word. I think he's probably better than a B grade, but obviously recency bias is letting me know, otherwise. It's going to be a change to Busio. I think you can make a real case that Busio is better than Huhi right now, and that's not to say Huhi is bad. I still think he's one of the best supports in the entire region, as he has been for the past 2 to 3 years, but Busio is just a special kind of talent. There's a reason this was the MVP of Academy over the past year. He probably has the biggest upside of anybody coming into the league right now, in terms of like rookies coming into the league. He's got that kind of upside that could dominate the league for many, many, many years. It's going to be incredibly interesting to see how he pairs with Doublelift as a bottom lane. You don't really see Doublelift taking on a lot of these more rookie-oriented supports. The last time he did that, I would have to imagine, was Biofrost on TSM in like 2016, and so pretty much every other time, Doublelift has had some established support that he knew he would be able to gel with. But Busio coming in, one of the highest touted prospects in Academy, and he definitely deserves it. Now, I'm going to say this, he's my number 2 rookie support coming in. We'll get to my number 1 in a bit, but as good as I think Busio is, it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be able to flip that switch immediately. Either way, moving on from Huki and Someday to Tenacity and Busio is generally a positive in my book, and I think shows a level of forward thinking from 100 Thieves that definitely puts this organization over the top. And it's the reason why ever since they joined the league in 2018, they have been a fixture at the top of the standings. It's because they're able to cycle talent. They're able to bring in guys, develop them in their academy, and push them forward like Tenacity and Busio are being done with right now. Of course, accentuating them with more veteran pieces like Bjergsen and Doublelift. Closer, sticking around for that 100 Thieves culture. It's definitely an intriguing roster that I'm going to be definitely interested to watch the entire year, but overall, the direction that 100 Thieves is moving in is definitely, I think there's positives and minuses. I do like pairing young players with veterans. I'm just not sure if these were the veterans I personally would have gone for, but at the very least, you're going to be getting a lot of views on your games, a lot of views on your content, and, sometimes in the long run, that can justify maybe bringing in a player that's a little bit of a downgrade here. Shout out all the Doublelift stands. That's going to bring us to our third and final Worlds team from 2022 here in the LCS. And that, of course, is Evil Geniuses. Now, EG definitely went in an intriguing direction this offseason, and I actually really, really like what they did. They kept a lot of this core together, most specifically Inspired JoJo, which I think is a great idea. They play off of each other incredibly well. They're a big reason why this team ended up with the best record in the regular season. Now, did they have some playoff lows? Yes, but were they pretty good at Worlds, especially in play-ins? Yes, they were, especially JoJo. I really think he's going to grow into one of the best players in the region. Both of them have A- level value, in my opinion. They're both hugely valuable pieces that pretty much any team in the region are going to want now. You could argue that JoJo's value is higher than A-. I think that is pretty normal take to have. If you wanted to call him the most valuable mid laner in the LCS, I certainly am not going to heavily dispute that. I think that there is a real argument to be made with that. His upside is limitless, and he is a resident, and so no import slot, and he's as good as he is, and he has the potential to keep growing. I do think he's great. Now, I will say, and this is going to be the only bit of negativity that I say about JoJo probably the entire year on this channel, but he was a little bit overhyped last year in terms of his actual on the Rift performance. He was a very good player, but him getting first team All-Pro just wasn't where I had him as a player. I thought he was closer to third team, which again, not a bad thing. Being a top 3 mid laner your rookie year in the LCS is a huge accomplishment, and he's probably only going to get better from that, but to pretend like he was far and away the best mid laner in the region last year, I just don't think was the case, right? There were certainly some matchups that he lost, certainly some draft phases that he was taken advantage of in because his playstyle can relatively be straightforward. He's very good at winning lane, and he's gotten a lot better at being able to transition that into a team advantage rather than just an individual advantage. But if he does play from behind, he is a little bit worse in that department. That's probably the reason I don't have him at A instead of A-, but A- I think is still pretty valuable, right? Like, he's still going to be up there with some of the most valuable pieces in the league. Pieces like Inspired, who's coming off of an MVP season. Yes, he is an A-, even though he was MVP. I've been criticized for this in the past when I gave Spica, I believe, a B+ grade after he won MVP, and people were not happy about that, but obviously that turned out pretty okay. I'm not here in the business to tell you how they did last year. I have an entire channel's worth of videos that kind of tell you how they did last year. I'm here to tell you where I think their value is going into this next year. I think Inspired's somewhere close to an A-, a very high-level jungler, but not someone who I would say is on the same level of value as someone like Blabber, who I just think, not being an import just gives you a little bit more flexibility. I think Blabber's a little bit more of a carry-oriented player, even if Inspired is probably a little bit better at facilitating the rest of the team. They both have their strengths and weaknesses, but Blabber gets that little bit of edge. People are going to get mad about that. People are going to get mad no matter how I put them. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Inspired is still an A-rated value player here. He's coming off of an MVP season. Bringing those two back is great. Bringing Vulcan back is also great. He's probably the second most valuable support in the region. He was the best support in the region last year. Obviously, Core JJ having a little bit of a down year, but Vulcan really showed up. Like, we were wondering how he was going to fit into this Evil Geniuses team. Coming over from Cloud9, they sell off their players, and a lot of times those players don't go on to have the most success away from Cloud9, but Vulcan definitely showed that his talent exceeds the Cloud9 system, and he really played fantastic last year, and I really don't expect anything else from him moving forward. He's still going to be one of the best supports in the region, and I don't even think it's really going to be all that close, but you do change out 2 members of the team here. I'm going to talk about the upgrade in the top lane first because this is going to get a little, it's probably going to get some people talking. Impact to Someday, to me, is a pretty big upgrade for Evil Geniuses. Impact is coming off of his worst year in North America by a considerable margin, in my opinion, where he was a little bit of a liability for Evil Geniuses throughout the year. Pretty much all of their losses, both in the regular season and in the playoffs, Impact was a big hindrance in. His laning, especially, was horrendous this past year. There's really no other way to put it. He was one of the worst laning top laners in the league. Now, he made up for that a bit by being one of the better team fighting top laners in the league, but he was pretty much always playing from a deficit. I talked about it a ton on this channel. His consistency in lane was super high because he was consistently down 20, 30 CS, and he would give up kills too. It's not like he was just playing safe and scaling into late game and being down CS. He was actively dying and actively a liability for this Evil Geniuses team. Now, obviously, he offers some things, generally speaking, in the late game that a lot of other top laners aren't going to offer, and I don't expect him to be what he was last year again this year, but going from Impact to Someday, I think, is just generally an upgrade in pretty much every aspect. Someday is still one of the best laners in the region, period. End of story at any role. Add that to being in the top lane where there's just not a lot of depth in the LCS especially, but even globally, there's really not a lot of top lane depth. Someday's value is incredibly high. He's a great laner. He's an even better team fighter. In fact, I would say that team fighting is his best aspect of his game. It used to be laning. I think he's transitioned that into a more team fight oriented approach, but he's great with resources. He's even better without resources. He has a huge champion pool. I really don't see a lot of weaknesses to Someday's game, and pretty much everything that you got from Impact, I think Someday gives you, but with added layers and with added consistency. And so that to me is a pretty big upgrade. You're going from, last year a top 4, top 5-ish top laner, if you want to be generous. When the games really mattered, he was around there, but, for most of the year, I think you could make a case he was a little lower than that. To what was, in my opinion, the best top laner in the league last year. Now, like I said, I'm not expecting Impact to be that guy. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. He's certainly not going to have a 2022 summer kind of year again. But even the Impact that I expect to get this year, I think, is a little bit lower on the totem pole than what Someday offers. He's just the best top laner in the league, and Evil Geniuses have to be really excited to get him. Then in the bot lane, weird situation. I'm not going to get into it because I don't know the full details. You don't know the full details. I promise. Danny is out. He's taking a break, or he's retired, or I don't know. Whatever it is, I wish him the best. Obviously, his own mental health and well-being is significantly more important than being a pro in this video game. And I'm one of the biggest proponents of legitimizing esports. But at the end of the day, like, any athlete, any competitor has to take care of themselves first before they can even remotely try to play at the highest level. Whatever's going on with Danny, I hope he's getting the help and the resources that he needs. But we're going to talk about that change. They're going from Danny to FBI here. Now, Danny was fantastic over the course of the summer split. He was incredibly consistent at team fighting, where I think his laning stats were a little bit, lower than people would expect him to be. I still think he was a huge positive. I did have him for my first team All-Pro in the bot lane. They're going from that to FBI, who I had as my second team All-Pro here in the bot lane. He was much more consistent with 100 Thieves than a lot of people give him credit for. I talked about this earlier. FBI was really good for a majority of the year. In fact, he was a big reason why 100 Thieves kind of hung on in that middle section of their summer split where they were really starting to struggle, where Abadage was really falling off the rails, where Closer had his worst games of the split by a large margin. FBI was really the one that was kind of holding it together. FBI and Someday, I should say, were really the two that were holding 100 Thieves together, and I think bringing them in here as a duo here to Evil Geniuses just kind of upgrades the overall outlook for this team, in my opinion. Because now, instead of worrying about whether or not a lot of these, hyper-aggressive plays are going to be consistently working, I think Someday and FBI offer you a level of consistency that you're not going to find in a lot of other players in the LCS. FBI has been and will continue to be one of the best laners in the league for the past few years. It's how he really made his name, was he was dominating people in lane phase on Golden Guardians. It's kind of transitioned a bit over the course of the years. I talked about this at Worlds, where FBI kind of came up as this big lane dominant player, but now I think he's a lot better on these scaling AD carries. It'll be interesting to see if that continues into the future, if he continues to want to play this more late game scaling oriented playstyle when you have more aggressive pieces on this team like JoJo and Inspired who like to generate their early leads. I think that could be a positive. Something we saw Danny really go to and really thrive on when he was on this team. I think FBI could do something very similar. It's going to also be interesting to see how FBI plays at a pro level without Huhi, because he's never played at a pro level without Huhi. I mean, obviously he did in Oceania, but, not in North America. It's FBI and Huhi have been the duo on Golden Guardians, on 100 Thieves. Now he's got Vulcan, who, in my opinion, is an upgrade to Huhi. I think he does basically everything Huhi does, but a little bit more consistently. Huhi's great on those engagers, but Vulcan is a much more well-rounded player with a very good sense of when to play aggressive and when to play passive, who he's great in team fights. I think Vulcan is a lot more consistent through the entirety of the game, so it'll be interesting to see how those two kind of play together in a dynamic, but it's hard for me to call this anything but a change. It's certainly not a downgrade, in my opinion, and I think generally speaking, FBI, stylistically fits into this team really, really, really well. So both Someday and FBI kind of coming into this Evil Geniuses core, I actually think makes this team a little bit better, and I know that's not a popular opinion to have. I've been seeing a lot of people kind of talk about LCS power rankings. Obviously, I'm not going to be going into that in this video. You're going to have to wait for those, but I don't really hear anyone mentioning Evil Geniuses in the top 3, and for this to be a third place team last year, and in my opinion, they only got better, especially in the top lane, I'm very surprised to hear that. It's definitely not something I would... this is a team I certainly do not want to sleep on going into next year. I think a lot of analysts are sleeping on EG right now, and it'll be interesting to see if they punish that throughout the rest of the year, but... I think this Evil Geniuses offseason was really good. With the circumstances that they were given, with Danny not being able to return here, FBI is a great replacement, one of the best in the region. Someday is arguably the best top laner you could have gotten when they found out he was available, I imagine. They pounced instantly. He's everything Impact gave you and more, and you're keeping the core, the best players on this team that really pushed you forward and inspired JoJo and Vulcan. So overall, Evil Geniuses offseason, in my opinion, pretty huge success, and, I think I'm a lot higher on this team generally moving into 2023 than a lot of other people are. Moving on from our top 3 Worlds teams last year in the LCS, we move on to the team that now finished 4th place, a team that definitely had Worlds aspirations last year, but couldn't quite make it. Of course, I'm talking about Team Liquid, and TL certainly made some changes over the off-season. This is a team that in recent years, most specifically, has definitely been attributed to spending money, attempting to put forward a really strong competitive team every single year, bringing in some big imports, signing some of the best endemic talent, really just trying to push as far as possible. Now, I'm not saying that they did not do that in this offseason, but they certainly went a different direction in that department. They have had one of the best academy teams for years. In fact, I would say they've had the best academy team for years. Players that have really been able to dominate the Academy League, players that are quite frankly too good for that league, and they're really starting to invest in some of those players. Not only the ones that we're going to see on this team here, but of course, another one that they ended up selling to another organization. That's not to say that they only went in on young talent here in Academy. Of course, they brought in some major imports, but we're going to start off with Core JJ returning here at the support position, the only player from Team Liquid that is going to be coming back here for 2023. And Core, pardon the pun, is the core of Team Liquid. He has been for many, many years now. He was the longest tenured player last year as well when they brought in Bjergsen and Hansama and Bwipo and really decided to go forward in that respect. He continues to be the longest tenured TL player here. He has done so much, not only for Team Liquid, but for North America as a whole. Now that he is a resident, a North American resident, I have no choice but to rate him as an A-level value. There really is no other thing I can say. Honestly, the worst thing that I can say about Core JJ is that for a little bit of last year, he was having a bit of a slump. But as I talked about in not only my playoff review, but my end-of-season review, the second half of his summer split was incredibly strong, and honestly much stronger than people give it credit for. I know a lot of people were talking about the Hansama Core JJ bot lane is kind of weak towards the back half of the year, but I think looking back on that, a lot of that was Hans being mispositioned and not so much Core having major problems. Now, that's not to say Core was perfect through the beginning half of the summer split. He certainly was not, but to pretend like he had a really bad last year and, was on that same level as maybe someone like an Impact who was a really good player coming off of a bad year, I just don't think is the case. I think Core really picked up his stride towards the back half of the year, even if it wasn't perfect all along. Totally understand running him back. I think there were some arguments to be made that you would go for someone like Ayla over Core JJ in this position, but bringing Core back, it's really hard to fault the team for that, especially with how much they've invested into, the Korean culture so far on this team, which we'll get to. You know what? Let's get to it now. Let's talk about the big imports first, and they're going to be in the top and the jungle here, as Team Liquid's going to be bringing in Summit, obviously formerly of Cloud9 last year at the beginning of spring, but they switched him out. He goes over to FPX, Fun Plus Phoenix in the LPL. That team is up and down, as you guys know from my LPL reviews last year, but for the most part, Summit I thought was relatively good over in the LPL. And then, of course, you're also bringing in Pioshik, who just won a world championship on DRX. And so certainly some high-profile acquisitions, high-profile signings, especially going from two players that I think are relatively popular, but not necessarily, like, known for their dominance, more so known for their team play in Bwipo and Santorin, kind of to more players who are known for their individual success in Summon and Pyosik. Now, obviously, not just that Pyosik has won Worlds, he's clearly a great team player, but Pyosik in the past has been known as a little bit of a resource hogger, at least in the jungle. I'm not, I'll talk about how that projects on this team, but certainly something to note there. Summit as well, definitely someone who likes resources up on that top side, very much a power top side player, which does track with a lot of what the rest of the team is probably going to want to do, but it's interesting that they bring those two in. Of course, both of them are going to be listed as A grades here. I have them as A minuses, mostly just because it really, when it comes to major imports like this, and especially someone like Pyosik, I need to see how they're going to adapt to playing in North America first. We've seen a lot of really high-profile Korean signings come into North America, and it really is about 50-50, maybe even a little less than that, to see which ones hit and which ones don't, which ones adapt to the playstyle and the culture and the team environment, and which ones just kind of struggle here. And obviously, no flame to the people who can't really, mentally get it together here in North America. It is a huge culture difference, and I can imagine moving here is going to be very different. It's just really hard for me to project that out over a value grade. I think generally speaking, they obviously deserve to have A, rated grades, in the A bracket, because simply as players, they are within that range in terms of talent, but it's all going to be about how they connect to the team. Now, obviously, them bringing in Marin to be the coach and really surrounding them with a lot of Korean-speaking people and Korean-speaking players from North America as well, I think is going to help that transition considerably for them, but we still need to see it. Summit was awesome for Cloud9, was still pretty good for FPX, but certainly a little bit more volatile. Pyosik, everybody knows, I'll talk about it here. I'm pretty biased. He's my favorite player in the world. He has been for many, many, many years. People who have followed the channel for 2-3+ years definitely know that. To see him come to North America, it's going to be really, really fun. And I think personality-wise, he definitely fits. It's just going to be interesting to see if he can continue on the momentum he had from the World Championships, because he was great at the tournament itself, but pretending like he was great all year long is a disservice to what DRX was. And of course, a lot of people forget that DRX was a 500 team in the LCK regular season, and a lot of that was because of Pyosik. He was someone who got benched for their qualification run in the Gauntlet, in the regional qualifiers in the LCK. So yes, he was fantastic at Worlds, and he is a great player with a lot of carry upside, but he is an incredibly volatile player in the similar vein to Summit. And so it's definitely going to be interesting. This is a very feast or famine decision. That's why I have them both top and jungle, I should say, listed as changes and not upgrades. While I do think both players are better, it'll be interesting to see if they actually perform like they're better consistently over the course of the year. That's something I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for. But that brings us to some of our promotions here from Academy, and I hate doing this because I really do admire Team Liquid for wanting to press forward with some of their Academy talent, especially these two who have really overperformed the expectations that were given to them when they were on Team Liquid. It always felt like Ayla was going to be the superstar of Team Liquid Academy. He was the one that was kind of being built for the main roster, but it's actually Harry and Jan that get called up here as the mid-AD carry duo. They're going to be given a lot of responsibility early on, having to replace Bjergsen and Hansama. Certainly not easy shoes to fill, and that's why I have them listed currently as downgrades. Not because I think that generally moving in that direction is the wrong idea, but I really just don't think these players are going to be on the level that those players were last year, this year. Jan, I think, is someone who I'm a little bit higher on, I think, than general public opinion. When you see a lot of the discourse surrounding Team Liquid Academy's bot lane of Jan and Ayla, a lot of people are hyping up Ayla, and trust me, I'm right there with them. I think he is the best support rookie coming into the league this year, even over Busio, who I still rate very highly. And even then, I still think Jan is very, very good. I think he's almost underrated in terms of his ability to both play out lane and play out team fights. He can get a little bit cocky. He can be a little bit of a negative presence from behind, but for the most part, there really aren't a lot of AD carry prospects in North America that I would rate nearly as highly as I would rate Jan. I think this is a really good addition, even if it is a downgrade from Hansama. I think he is the one I feel more confident in here, and I think you could really argue that this should be listed as a change more than a downgrade because of what Hansama was giving to Team Liquid last year. But for me, this is going to be a little bit of a downgrade because, in my opinion, I just don't see Jan, even as highly as I think of him, being on the same level as a player like Hansama in 2023. Do I think he could develop into that maybe close to the end of the year? Yes, I don't know about the development track right now. He's definitely still more of a prospect than a guaranteed finished product. He's just a very good prospect in my eyes, somebody that I really have a lot of high hopes for. And then Harry in the mid lane. This one's a little bit more clear-cut. Harry's a really good player, but I don't think he is going to give you what Bjergsen gave you. Bjergsen was a win con for this team in every single game because it felt like no matter how long the game went on, Bjergsen would just get better over the course of that game. A lot of TL's wins were mediocre early games, and then Bjergsen doing a lot in team fights towards the back half, especially towards the end half of the year for Team Liquid, and Harry's just not that player for you. You're mixing up the dynamic a lot, but going straight from Bjergsen to Harry isn't necessarily going to be an upgrade. Now, Harry is a good player. He's certainly, you know, a good mid laner. I just don't know if I would consider him like a top-tier prospect. I think a lot of the top-tier prospects coming up this year are big names that we've been hearing about for a while. We're looking at Tenacity and Busio coming up for 100 Thieves. We're looking at Ayla and Yon coming up here for TLA's bot lane and, you know, going to different places. I don't think Harry is on that level when it comes to a call-up from Academy. I think he's, you know, if they are B values, I think Harry is probably a B- value. Still a good prospect, not someone who I would consider a negative. You know, he's not a C. He's not an average prospect coming up. He's still in the B bracket, but maybe not necessarily on that same level. And to replace the person who, in my opinion, was arguably the most influential for you down the stretch last year, it's definitely big shoes to fill, and hopefully he can grow into that. I don't have a ton of high hopes for him to be able to do it in year one, but hopefully an organization like Team Liquid, which understands the power of development, understands the power of giving players time, is going to give Harry and Yon time, because I have a sinking suspicion they're just not going to be where they want from day one, but they might be able to get there as long as they're given the leeway to be able to get there. So it'll be interesting with Team Liquid to see whether or not this roster actually performs. I think generally speaking, I'm a little bit mixed on where this roster went in the offseason. I think you got rid of a ton of consistency for a ton of volatility. This could potentially be a much better roster than last year with Bjergsen, Hansama, kind of the consistently good but not great duo out. Harry, Yon, you got Summit and Pioshik in the top side who are incredibly volatile but incredibly explosive players, and you still got Core to anchor it all. This could be a very fun team to watch, and in fact, I predict this is going to be an incredibly fun team to watch, but in terms of outcomes, I'm definitely going to need to see them play together before I feel like I have a really good grasp on how good this offseason is for TL. Moving on to our next team here, and it's a team that I don't think a lot of people expected to do as well as they did in summer, me included, certainly in that debate. Coming in at number 5 here, and the 5th place team from summer is CLG, Counter Logic Gaming, and finally, a quick one to talk about because they didn't make any changes. They are the only team in the LCS to make 0 changes going into the next season. Obviously, 100 Thieves really setting the precedent with that last year after they won summer. CLG overperforming all expectations and saying, hey, we're not a big market, big budget team. We're going to stick with the core that we have, and we're going to run it back. We're going to try to improve. We saw a lot of growth from a lot of these players over the course of the year, and we're just going to keep it rolling. And you know what? I love that mentality. You can look at all of the values, and you can say, well, this certainly doesn't look like a 5th place team, because guess what? I have literally everyone on this team as B- value, which again, if you go back to kind of what I was saying, it means they are solid starters, not necessarily dominant value pieces. Dokla's not someone who I think was getting attention from Cloud9 to come in and play top lane or consideration. Same with anybody else here, right? Or 100 Thieves or Evil Geniuses or anybody like that. But they're solid players that are going to help your franchise stabilize and push itself forward. And I think CLG is really just a group of players like that. If I had to point out one player that I think maybe deserves a higher value rating than that, it would be Luger here. But I do think that he is really, really good and really fun to watch. And in fact, someone who I think a lot of people are underrating going into next year. But the biggest problem is he is the only import on this team. So if he's the only B value and the rest are B minuses, he actually kind of gets knocked down to B minus because of his import status. And so they all come in here at B minus. I'll quickly talk about these players, but I'm going to save a lot of the discussion for how this team kind of worked out to the Power Rankings video that I'm going to release before the season starts. But for Dokla, I mean, this is the poster child for why you don't give up on players because of age. I mean, this is someone who had his experience, had his time in the LCS on Optic, really wasn't all that impressive. In fact, was pretty bad for a majority of his time there, was pretty underwhelming. Maybe not bad, but just underwhelming for his time there. Was given a couple more shots in both Academy and Amateur, and then back in Academy. Won Prospect of the Year in Academy and was given a shot here on the main roster by CLG, and he has completely turned it around. He was fantastic for most of last split. Now, Do I expect him to be able to keep that up completely consistently? I'm just not so sure. If he can be that more aggressive, strong side top laner that I think he was for a majority of last year, that makes this team a lot more volatile and a lot more fun to watch, and it increases their ceiling by quite a bit. But I think the top lane talent in the LCS grew a considerable amount over the offseason. Top lane was really weak last year in the LCS, in my opinion, and Doklo was able to dominate some of the lower tier top laners that I think just generally got upgraded across the league. So it'll be interesting to see how he does in the grand scheme of the rest of these players. I definitely don't want to say that he can't perform. It's just going to be more of a wait and see. Contracts, another player that I think maybe gets I hate saying this because I love Contracts as a player and I love him as a person, you know, all the docs and everything, all the videos that have been done on him. He's just, his story is awesome and you want to root for him, but he's a player that I really have a hard time trusting in terms of these value rankings. He's a player that seems to flip-flop every single year from being good to bad to good to bad. And he just had a good year, which does scare me going into 2023, but if he can play like he did last year, yes, he was a little bit inconsistent over the course of the year. I talked about it plenty in my videos, but he definitely had more ups than downs, and I think that really contributed to CLG being a winning team. One player that I really want to shout out that is getting no credit for how good he was last year was Palafox. He actually got All-Pro considerations from me. I don't think I ended up giving him an All-Pro slot, or maybe I did. You in the comments will let me know, but he was definitely on my radar as an all-pro mid laner. He was fantastic, specifically towards the beginning half of the summer split. I think a lot of the pressure was taken off of him towards the second half. It was given to Contracts, it was given to Dokla on that top side to really be able to push forward, but Palafox really was great over the course of last year. I think a lot of people were talking about, obviously, his comments about name tags over player skill, and he really proved that when he was able to beat up players like Abadage and Bjergsen in solo lane matchups in the regular season. Now, he did fold a bit in the playoffs where he really was overmatched, but I think you could say that is the case for most of this team, having to play that Cloud9 series and really just kind of getting the floor wipe with them and then really struggling against Golden Guardians in the playoffs as well. But generally speaking, I think Palafox is underrated going into next year. He's a player who I really like, and I'm definitely excited to see get another shot to be a good mid laner in the LCS, because I do believe he can be a, you know, top 5 mid laner in the LCS for, you know, a multiple number of years, which is not an easy feat to do. And then you've got Luger and Poom in the bot lane. They've been together forever since the 100 Thieves Academy days, and they really showed it last year. Poom definitely had his moments where he was a little bit iffy. Definitely probably the player on this team outside of Contracts that I'm the most worried about. Contracts only because it's just who he is. He's going to int or he's going to, you know, carry the game. It's just kind of the nature of him. But Poom has some moments where it's like, oh, you know, maybe dial it back a bit. But Luger's fantastic. He's a great positioner and a great team fighter. His laning phase isn't bad either. I think on a better team, he would get a lot more spotlight, similar to that of what someone like Danny was getting on Evil Geniuses. I'm not saying he's the same level as Danny. There's a reason I have him as B- value instead of A value like I had for Danny, but Luger is a very, very good player that I think a lot of people are going to underrate going into this next year. Luger and Poom generally as a duo is not necessarily going to blow your socks off, but it's very rare that they like hyper lose a lane. I think there were multiple points throughout last year where you could have made the case that they were a top 3 bot lane in the LCS purely because of the consistency that they were offering on a game-to-game basis. So for CLG, you've just got to be happy that they're able to keep the core together. I'm a little bit worried about some natural regression from players that did overperform last year, but if they can keep up the form that they had in 2022, 2023 should be another year of growth for a franchise that has desperately needed to see some results for quite some time. Well, that's going to be the first half of LCS teams done and dusted. It's time to move into our second half here, starting with the number 6 team from the LCS in 2022 summer, and that was a surprising finish in playoffs from TSM, Team SoloMid. This was a team that finished 6-12 in the regular season. Not a very good record. Very much struggled out the gate. Really tried to adapt towards the back half of the split, changing pretty much the entirety of their starting lineup, really only keeping Spica and Maple. Of course, Tactical kind of coming in and out over the course of playoffs as well, but 2 major additions for TSM through the second half of that year being Solo in the top lane, Chime in the support position, both of them returning now for 2023, and them looking to build around this kind of small core that really did push them a little bit over the edge or over some of the other kind of middle tier teams in the playoffs. I definitely want to talk about that. Obviously, I feel pretty good about the core of TSM that they kind of returned here, although not perfect. Anybody who watched the channel last year knows that I was really starting to feel TSM towards the end of last year and going into playoffs. I was probably one of the few people to actually kind of see them being able to move on against FlyQuest, to see them being able to take a best of 5 series against FlyQuest. And I think a lot of that and a lot of my optimism was because of how well Chime was playing at support. He really kind of unlocked himself. Last year, obviously, there's been a lot of memes surrounding Chime over the course of the past, I would say, 2 years. Obviously, the TriCast, kind of influencing a lot of those from his time on Golden Guardians, but he went back down to Academy after a rough rookie year, and he was really good for Golden Guardians Academy, enough so that TSM felt comfortable to be able to purchase him mid-split and promote him to the main roster, and he was fantastic. I mean, he was great. He was everywhere on the map that he needed to be. His laning stats were good. His roaming stats were great. Really just everything that he was doing was great. He was kind of on pace to be one of the best supports in the league, period, end of story. And if he continues that kind of progression, that's going to be a great keep and a great acquisition for TSM. In my opinion, he is the best player on this team. And so for them to be able to keep him, I thought was really, really, really big for them. Obviously, they're also able to keep Solo in the top lane. Now, Solo had his ups and downs for sure. He was actually kind of meh in Academy for his time there. They were kind of splitting time, him and Sol. Sol obviously had his time up on the main roster, and then they moved him down through weird circumstances, and Solo came up, but Solo was actually much better on the main roster than he ever was in Academy, which is a very weird thing to say, but he was actually really good at being able to take resources and distribute them really nicely in the mid game. This is something that I compliment players like Someday and players like Impact on a lot, is the fact that, yes, they're great without resources, they're great weak side players, just like Solo, in my opinion, is a great weak side player, but he's also very good at getting resources and making sure that he's able to affect the entire map and not just kind of try and snowball his own lane. He has a very good sense of macro play, and he knows how to be aggressive when he does generate his own lead, and I think that was something that was good for TSM. Do I think he's some superstar top laner? No, I just don't think he's going to be one of the best top laners in the league. He hasn't been that really at any point in his career. He's definitely shown signs of flashes, I should say, of being very, very good, but nothing that was ever consistent enough for me to consider him like a top 4, top 5 top laner. He's going to be just below that bar for me, just below the bar of like Dokla, players like that. Still a very good player, one you're not really concerned at all about having your starting lineup. That's why the C+ grade is there, because I think that Solo, generally speaking, is going to be fine as a top laner, but not really someone who's going to be pushing your team over the edge like I think a player like Chime theoretically could be for a middle tier team. That brings us to the final player that they are returning here in 2023, and that is going to be Maple. Maple is an interesting case because he came in with a lot of fanfare going into last year. A lot of people had high expectations for him. I was certainly not on that train. I was on the lower expectations. I've been watching him in the LPL over the past 4 or so years, and even on his little stint in the PCS, he wasn't as dominant as he used to be. This was someone who I had very low expectations for going into last year, and he was exactly what I thought he was going to be. He was a fine mid laner, maybe a slightly below average mid laner in terms of LCS standards, and I think he's probably going to continue that trend going into 2023. In fact, I think that there is a pretty good chance that maybe he is even worse than that. I think the C+ value grade there on Maple is maybe a little bit generous for what he might be able to put out over the course of this year, but I think over the course of this offseason, I've learned that around the league, I think people at least still see Maple as a pretty competent starting mid laner, even if I'm not entirely sure that he's going to be able to live up to that bill, so I'm going to rank him as such. I don't think he's a bad player, I just think he's fine. He's not someone who's going to push your team over the top. I think he's slightly worse than Solo, but for me, they get the same value grade just because it seems like both players were around the same value in the offseason for many teams, and so those 3 players coming back, I definitely understand, although it is unfortunate because you are losing your best player on the team in Spica. Now, there really was no way that you were going to get Spica back. He had a really rough year overall on TSM last year. TSM in general just didn't feel very good. Spica did his absolute darndest to try and carry this team throughout the regular season. He finally got some help when Chime joined the team, and they were able to kind of put together some really nice series over the course of the playoffs, but him leaving, you're replacing him with an import here in Boogie. Now, I've watched a bit of film on Boogie. I'm going to have to get to a lot more of it as we go on throughout the offseason, but what I've seen from him, he is definitely a work in progress. Certainly not a player that is, completely done with his development track. Someone who I think can be very good and can be an explosive player. Very similar, in my opinion, to what Jose Deodo was coming into the league. Someone who I do like the flash plays of, but who over the course of a season definitely makes a lot of meh plays as well. I think Boogie is a little bit better than what I saw out of Jose Deodo, at least before he came into the LCS, and so that's got to be at least a little bit of a consolation for TSM fans, but going from a player like Spica to a player like Boogie, just not it can't be considered an upgrade. This is a downgrade. There is really no way that Boogie in year one is going to be able to contribute what a player like Spica was able to contribute for this TSM team. And I think overall, that is definitely going to be a negative on the side of TSM. This team was already struggling to put forward a lot of dominant wins, and now they've lost really their biggest carry threat. That's definitely a problem. Hopefully Boogie can step into those shoes. Again, like I said, I've watched quite a bit of film of him, but not like a ridiculous extensive amount of film of him. I've probably watched 2 or 3 games at most, and so definitely going to try to get more of that going into power ranking season and everything, but from what I've seen now, he's just an okay player that has a decent understanding of early pathing, plays really well from ahead, and plays mediocre from behind, which is something that, you know, this TSM team is probably going to be playing from, you know, more often than not, just because of the players surrounding. And so, yes, this is a downgrade, but theoretically, I think if everything goes right for TSM, this could be a change. I don't really see a world in which this is an upgrade for TSM. This is a consolation for having to lose your best player. Spica was not going to be returning to TSM after last year, and so you just had to do the best that you could to make sure that you replaced him with a player that could fill his shoes, and I think Boogie is at least a decent attempt at that. There are better ones out there, but I think it's decent. I'm not going to completely criticize this. It's just unfortunate for TSM that they have to downgrade so much in arguably their most important role. But that brings us to the 5th and final team member that changed here, and it's going to be Neo starting now for the 2023 TSM team as the bot laner. Now, it's really hard to talk about this situation because Tactical obviously was in and out, yet Instinct in there. Both of them I would consider, you know, D+, C- level or value players. Tactical in that D range because if you remember, that D range was kind of established for unreliable assets, you know, things that I think, players that I think teams are very concerned about giving a lot of chances to. Tactical, I think, definitely played himself into that role over the course of last year, but I think you can make a real case that Neo is in that same boat as well. This was a player who was starting for the worst team in the league, and Dignitas for a majority of last year. Obviously, Immortals was bad too, but Dignitas in terms of talent was pretty much always near the bottom, and then he got benched, and Spawn came in, and the team got better. Yes, I know it was bigger than that. They brought in other pieces in that team too, but Neo wasn't exactly lighting the Academy world on fire when he was going down there either. And so it's definitely interesting for me that TSM ends up going for him instead of some of the other endemic North American bot laners that are on the market. In my opinion, most notably Johnson. I'm very surprised to see Neo get a spot in the LCS over Johnson, who I think had a very good split last year on FlyQuest, at least over the course of the regular season. Now, I know the narrative surrounding Johnson has always been he's only good with Aphromoo, but Chime's a very good support. If the problem is not like, oh, it has to be Aphromoo, it just needs to be a good support, you have that here on TSM. And Chime and Aphromoo, you know, stylistically really aren't all that different. They do play very similarly, in my opinion, and so to bring Neo in here, it just felt like a little bit of a question mark, especially with Johnson sitting at home. But what does Neo offer you? He offers you a relatively reliable laner. He's someone who I think can generally generate his own leads if given enough time. Now, is he going to be able to do that at a top-tier level in the LCS? Probably not. I don't believe that in any way, shape, or form. But can he go up against some of the more mid-tier AD carries and hold his own in terms of laning? I think so, and that's going to unlock Chime to be able to either play lane to win or to be able to roam around the map and trust that Neo's not going to be able to lose. My biggest problem with Neo has always been his ability to teamfight later in games. He really is a lower quality team fighter than what you would expect from an LCS bot laner, and that is going to be a little bit of a problem. You look at the rest of this team and the composition and how it works. You don't really have that big late-game carry player. Like, Solo's certainly not going to be that. Boogie hopefully can turn into that, but again, he's even more so an early-game player. Maple really isn't a carry-oriented player at this point in his career. He was really never given that designation, I should say, last year when he was, you know, really highly touted, and now going into this year, I don't even think he has that expectation, and so I really don't know what your late game is going to be looking like for TSM. I think Neo is a little bit scary in that respect. If he can kind of rebound to what he was in 2021 when he had that rookie year with Aphromoo in Dignitas, I think that it's going to be a lot better for TSM. I think this team is going to look a lot better, but as it is now, I think bringing Neo in is actually a little bit of a cause for concern. Add that on to the fact that you're downgrading in the jungle. Again, not entirely your fault, but it is certainly something to keep note of. And that Maple and even a player like Solo aren't superstars. I am very worried about the direction that this TSM team is going in. They are one of the few teams in the league that I do think got worse over the course of the offseason. I think they will be going into 2023 as a worse team. And this is a team that already went 6-12 last year. I'm not expecting a ton from TSM over the course of the next year, but hopefully that they can, you can get some development out of some of these young players, and you can hopefully surprise a lot of people that may not be expecting a ton from you going into that next season. Moving on to our 7th team now, and this is one that I think a lot of people have been waiting to hear me talk about. Probably the team that I am most excited to talk about in this video and throughout the rest of this offseason for the LCS. Coming in at number 7 is, of course, FlyQuest, and oh boy, did FlyQuest make some changes going into 2023. Not a single member of the 2022 FlyQuest roster is returning, and that, for the most part, is a good thing. In fact, I think in pretty much every case, it's something that I am incredibly excited about and something that you just have to tip your cap to FlyQuest for. We're going to go from top to support here. I'm not going to go in any sort of particular order, just going to go by role here, talking about how some of these changes were made and how I think, I feel about them. In the top lane, you bring in some stability. This is something that they have been looking for quite a while. We have to remember, this was the team that did end up purchasing Licorice from Cloud9 a couple of years ago. That was after their Worlds run where they had Solo as a top laner who was fine, but they've really been looking for that stability on the top side where they can really just plug someone in, count on them to be able to play through the rest of the map for a while. Obviously, new management, I'm not saying it's the same regime, but it's really been a theme for FlyQuest. Kumo was another addition that they were really hoping was going to solidify that top side. They ended up going with Philip last year, who was a lot better than I thought he was going to be. He, filled in his role admirably and actually played pretty well over the course of the year, but he really is non-comparable to what Impact is going to be offering here. This is one of the best, if not the best top laner in LCS history, and him being here is definitely going to be a big presence for FlyQuest. I know I talked him down a bit earlier in the video on the Evil Geniuses slide, but that's mostly because his 2022 was a down year. I don't expect that, like I said, to translate nearly as much into 2023. I think a lot of the pieces surrounding him here on FlyQuest are really going to enable Impact to get back to the game that I think he was most comfortable playing. He can take the early game off a bit. I know his laning stats were awful last year. I don't expect them to improve like a ridiculous amount, but he doesn't have to have that burden on him in the early game because you've got a lot of early game players on this team, on this FlyQuest roster. He can be that late game team fighter on picks like the Gangplank that we know he can still play at a relatively high level. I think he's going to be perfect for this FlyQuest roster. Hard to call this anything but an upgrade for Fly. And then you've got the jungle change. I think this is another pretty massive upgrade for this team. You're going from Jose Deodo last year, who has always shown signs and flashes of being very good. He had moments last year where he was great, but he also had moments where he was meh, especially in the playoff run where he really let FlyQuest down, in my opinion. You're going from that to Spica, who is a former MVP in this league, someone who had a very good last year, even on a bad team. I know that's a little bit of a controversial opinion, but I talked about it a lot on the channel. I thought Spica was underrated as a player throughout most of last year. For you to be able to go from Jose Deodo to Spica, that's just a straight upgrade here in the jungle position. He's a carry-oriented player that's really good with resources, but is very good at passing those resources on as well. He is kind of this all-encompassing jungler. I think he's in that upper tier of junglers. He gets that B+ grade from me. That's going to be right in line with players like Closer, players like Santorin. I think he falls right in line with players like that. A very, very competent jungler that basically any team in the league would very, very much like to have. I think Spica is going to be a huge addition to this FlyQuest team. Hopefully he can mesh well with some of the imports that are coming in, but already through the top two players, you've upgraded a considerable amount. Going from Philip and Jose Deodo on the top side to Impact and Spica is always going to be a major plus for whatever team ended up doing it, but that's only the start of the interesting additions because now we have to go to the two big imports here in the LCS this offseason. You can talk about Summon and Pioshit kind of being the other two big imports, but you have to talk about Vikla and Prince coming in here for FlyQuest, replacing Takuya and Johnson. Now, I do want to talk about this a bit. A lot of people are going to be mad that I have Takuya to Vikla as a change, and I understand that. I know a lot of people aren't nearly as high on Takuya as I was over the course of last year, but to me, and this was reflected in my all-pro voting and in pretty much everything. Takuya was the best mid laner in the LCS last year, and I do believe that. I think Vikla could come in and also be the best mid laner in the LCS, but for me, it's really hard to say getting rid of Takuya is anything but a change. It's hard to upgrade from him unless you're getting one of the best mid laners in the world, and unfortunately, for me, I'm a little bit lower on Vikla than I think a majority of the populace. He was the rookie of the split in the LCK last year on KT Rolster. Came in mid-split for Arya and really helped put that team over the edge. Him and Aiming were really good over the second half, but in my opinion, I just thought he was fine. He was there. A lot of people are attributing the causation of KT Rolster getting a lot better to the fact that Vikla came in and was a lot better than Arya. And while I do think he was a lot better than Arya, especially in that role, I don't think he was the one that was like carrying KT Rolster by any stretch of the imagination to a lot of those wins. I still think he is going to be arguably the best mid laner in the LCS, but he's not this superstar global level player that I think is coming into the LCS that I think a lot of people are seeing him as. I have him as an A- grade. I think potentially he could be higher than that if he does live up to that potential. He could potentially be a little bit lower than that. This, is kind of in that middle balance where I think he could be somewhere around the talent level of a player like Prince, who we'll talk about in just a second, but he could just as easily be closer to the talent level of someone like Crown. If you remember when Crown came into Optic Gaming and then later CLG, he was a good player, but he wasn't someone that was completely setting the league on fire and then eventually fell off. I think he's going to be somewhere in that range. I don't quite know where yet. I do think that, Vikla is a good player. I'm just going to need to see him very similarly to how I feel about Pioshik. I'm going to need to see him play in North America before I feel entirely comfortable about saying that he's just going to dominate. One player who I don't feel any remorse in saying that he's going to dominate pretty early on just because the talent level is just simply there is Prince. Prince coming in here was phenomenal last year. There's really no takeaways from that. If I had a little bit of reservation on Vikla because his contributions to his team last year were maybe a little bit overrated, I think Prince's contributions to his team were very properly rated. In my opinion, he was the second best player in the LCK last year. He finished second in MVP voting for me, only behind Ruler, and he almost single-handedly dragged that Live Sandbox team to Worlds, and that really has to feel good for a FlyQuest team that really needed that, that punch, that push over the edge. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how this bot lane gels because Prince Ayla as a bot lane has the potential to be the single best bot lane in the league by a considerable margin, not even close. But obviously, language barrier, two players that have really never played in similar ecosystems before. It's going to be interesting to see how those two connect. Adding Prince onto a roster that also has Spica as well is very interesting. I want to say this about Prince in terms of stylistic, tendencies, and I'll say this about Vikla as well. Prince is a carry player. He can carry in the early game, he can carry in the late game. It doesn't really matter to him. He is going to pick a part of the game that he's going to dominate in. Usually he's not just going to, destroy you in lane unless he's picking an early game champion, and he's not going to obliterate team fights unless he's on a late game champion, but he can do anything, kind of depending on what the team comp needs him to do. Very flexible player, but pretty much is always going to want to have resources because why would you not want to give resources to what is your best player? And then you've got Vikla here in the mid lane, who I think is a little bit more of a passive, supportive mid laner. That's not a bad thing. I think that could be very good on a team where the jungler is a little bit more resource heavy, where you're hoping that the bot lane can pick up a lot of those resources. I think Vikla just being a really strong laner that can hopefully win by 15 or so CS into any matchup in the league is going to be great. But Prince is going to get an A grade here. He's an A+ player, but he is an import slot, so that drops down to A. I think you can make a real case that going into next year, Prince is the single most talented player in the LCS, but for me, that comes out to about an A grade overall for his value. And then finally, I talked about it a little bit already. You've got Ayla and the support position. Now, this is going to be incredibly interesting to watch because I talked about it a bit earlier. Ayla is the rookie that I am most looking forward to seeing in the LCS this split. I think he's been the single best player in Academy for 2 years now. He is taking over some big shoes in Aphromoo. That's why I can't call this a straight upgrade. Ayla has played very few games at the LCS level, even though those have been very good, and I do believe Ayla will probably be better than Aphromoo in year one, but it's really hard for me to say that with extreme confidence considering he's never had a full-time split as a starter in the LCS, and so Afro being a really good player, I'm going to consider that a change, but realistically speaking, I would expect Ayla to be able to come in here and be better than what Afro was for this team last year. I think basically from moment one, Ayla can be a top 3, top 2 even support in the LCS. He really is that good, and I think a lot of people are going to hopefully not overlook him as the year goes on. I don't think a lot of people are overlooking him now. He has a lot of pedigree behind him as a prospect, and I think that's going to carry in. Like I said, the interesting part of that bot lane is going to be how Prince and Ayla kind of mesh as a duo, because if they can click, if both of them can play at the levels that they've been playing at the past year or so, if Prince can be Live Sandbox Prince and Ayla can be the the support that's been dominating Academy, this should be the best team in the LCS, and it shouldn't really be all that close. But there are obviously a lot more intricacies to that question than just, these players playing at the level that they played out last year. You got to take fit into account, but whatever the end, the end result ends up being, you got to give a ton of credit to Papa Smithy and this entire FlyQuest organization for being able to put together a roster that has generated so much excitement for an organization that has kind of lacked the ability to do that in recent years. And so for FlyQuest, you have to consider this offseason a major and massive win. I can't imagine there is going to be a bigger winner in the LCS in terms of offseason. In fact, I'll say it now, FlyQuest is the biggest winner in this offseason for me. They absolutely dominated this, and whether or not they come out and, dominate the league like I think their talent level should suggest, they've at least put everything together to make it so they have the opportunity to do so. And for an organization like Fly that's not one of the top 5, that's about as good as you could ask for. That's going to bring us to our bottom 3 teams from last split, and these teams were kind of neck and neck throughout the entirety of the split, trying to decide who was the worst team overall. One of them ended up making playoffs, and the one that kind of snuck in and actually made a little bit of noise in their playoff run was, of course, Golden Guardians. They finished 8th with a 5-13 record, and they made a few changes this offseason. Now, I'm not going to say they were monumental, but honestly, movements in an intriguing direction for this Golden Guardians team. They did retain a lot of the pieces that they had from last year, a lot of the pieces that they really liked moving forward with, most notably River, obviously, who they acquired midway through the summer split from Dignitas. He was a player who I think was playing really well over the course of the beginning part of the year, spring especially. I think he was playing some of the best league that he played all year long, and really started to taper off as the split went on. In fact, I was very critical of River over the course of the 2022 summer split for Dignitas and Golden Guardians. I actually thought he was more of a net negative for the team overall, but this is a player that we know can play at a relatively decent level. It seems teams around the league definitely still value him. Golden Guardians clearly enough to retain him and to be able to, last year want to acquire him in the midst of a playoff push for this team. And so he definitely still has value, but he's going to have to recover a bit from what was a kind of downward spiral towards the end of last year. This is someone who really broke out in the lock-in tournament at the beginning of 2022. Obviously, he was really good before that in the PCS, but I'm talking about in the LCS. Really kind of caught people's attention when Dignitas overperformed in that lock-in tournament. Really didn't have performances like that in the regular season, and so, kind of raised some question marks there, and then got even worse over the course of summer. If he can get back to that form that he was, especially in the PCS over the past few years, but even more so just spring form, a generally decent jungler that's going to be, okay in the grand scheme of things, I think Golden Guardians is going to be happy with that. They do retain Licorice in the top lane as well. Now, Licorice is also coming off of probably his worst split of his career. This is somebody who, burst onto the scene with Cloud9, had some fantastic years, made the semifinals of Worlds, was eventually moved on to FlyQuest and then Golden Guardians, and really has not been the same ever since leaving C9. There are a lot of players that share that same story. Licorice is definitely one of them. He actually had some good games last year. I think mostly when he was able to play some of these more aggressive picks in the top lane, some split pushers, duelists, things like the Fiora, Jax come to mind for things that Licorice I think looked a lot better on, but he was getting some of those matchups later in the year, and he was losing them pretty hard. He's going to need to rebound. He's going to need to get back to some of the form that he had in spring rather than the form that he had in summer. That's going to be a big theme here for Golden Guardians. I'm not saying that this team cannot do that, because they certainly have the talent to be able to pull that off. It's just going to be about whether or not they can actually do it. They also retain 6A here in the bottom lane. 6A is fine. He's not going to completely change the trajectory of your franchise, but he's also not going to, shit the bed and be completely awful. He's going to be one of the lower tier 80 carries in the region. He's very consistent at being fine. He's never going to just straight up win you games unless you draft a comp entirely around him, and he's not really ever going to be able to push your team over the top, but he's also really never going to lose you games, and especially pairing him with a big playmaking support like they did this offseason, I think could be a good, kind of change of pace for this Golden Guardians team, but overall, I'm just not sure I'm on the train of Stixxay needing to start in the LCS in 2022, like I said, especially with players like Johnson not having a team. It seems very interesting to me that this team would continue to stick with Stixxay. Obviously, very good connection between the bot laner and the new support that they brought in, and of course, Stixxay often functions as more of a coach for this team. Anyways, he actually did function as a coach and had to step back in as a player last year when they weren't able to get one of their players, their Academy AD carry, in there in time for the season to start. But, just someone who's going to be fine, not someone who's really going to make me all that excited about the, long-term prospects of Golden Guardians. I don't blame them for keeping him as their AD carry, but it's certainly not something that I'm going to be, freaking out over. But they do make 2 changes this offseason. We're going to start with the support position because I think it's a little bit easier to talk about. This is just a straight upgrade, in my opinion. You're going from Ole last year, who certainly had his moments, but also had some bad moments. His champion pool is very eclectic, but when he wasn't able to get that surprise factor, wasn't able to get things like the Mundo or, some of these crazier picks that he was able to pull out, he just wasn't nearly as effective as pretty much any other support in the league. You're able to go from that to Huhi, who has been one of the consistently, top 3, 4 best supports in the region for the past 3 or so years. That is a great addition. You're bringing him back here to Golden Guardians, where he really revitalized his career as a support. You're pairing him back up with Stixxay, obviously 2 former teammates from the CLG days when they were really good. Huhi at the time was a mid laner, but I imagine those 2 are at least relatively on the same page in terms of shot calling. It's going to be interesting to see those 2 as a dynamic, and Huhi, in my opinion, a very strong and a very straightforward upgrade here for Golden Guardians in the support position. I would actually argue that across the league, this is one of the biggest just straight up upgrades in terms of position, replacements in the league. Ole to Huhi is a pretty big jump for Golden Guardians, and they got to be really, really excited about that. Obviously, talked about Huhi a bit on the 100 Thieves section, but this is someone who has been very consistent as a playmaker, most notably in team fights. His team fighting has been genuinely phenomenal, and that's something that I think Golden Guardians is really going to try to capitalize on, because they also bring in Gory in the mid lane. Now, Gory is a player that a lot of you might be familiar with from multiple avenues. He was fantastic in 2021 on Nongshim Red Force in the LCK, where that team almost made Worlds. Obviously, a lot of those players going on to bigger and better things the year after. Gory going on to FPX, Fun Plus Phoenix, where he really wasn't all that good in Spring Split. He really took a big dip, ended up getting kicked off the team. Care replaces him for the Summer Split. He goes to the PCS, he goes to PSG Talon, kind of the most dominant team in the PCS, and they're not actually able to qualify for Worlds. So Gory coming off of a very rough 2022, but Gory himself is a good player. He showed that in 2021 on Nongshim. I think 2022 was a little bit of a disastrous year for him. He could be another one of those players that comes in and completely shits the bed. That's why I have him as one of the lowest import ratings in the entire region here with the C+. There's not going to be a lot of players that I think are around that level, but, you want to put him on that same level as someone like a Maple. I think that's a fair comparison to make. Gory is a decent player. He's not really someone who is going to be dominating in terms of experience and in terms of resources. He's not a super resource-heavy player, or at least he hasn't been on his teams in the past, but he's not someone who's going to make your team worse, which I think generally is a good thing. I do consider it a slight upgrade to go from a Blaze Olive to Gory. I think you could realistically call this a change as well. A Blaze Olive does give you a lot of good moments, maybe some more than what I would expect Gory to be able to give you, but a Blaze Olive also had his bad moments where he was just a little bit overmatched, tried to make a little bit too many plays. I actually praised him for this a bit at the end of last year. I'm a little bit higher on a Blaze Olive than I think most other people are, but I praised him a bit for at least trying to make plays when this team was down gold. You would see a lot of crazy plays being made from maybe when the team was losing, but I think that kind of has to happen. You kind of have to go for broke if your team is losing and you're not as talented. He kind of got that memo, and I don't think a lot of the other players did. Gory's not essentially going to give you that. He's going to be a lot more passive as a player, but I think generally is going to be more consistent, which when you look at the rest of this lineup, a player like River, very volatile. A player like Licorice, very volatile, especially considering their performances last year. I think having a more stable mid laner like Gory is actually going to be to the benefit of this Golden Guardians team. So for me, it's going to be a slight upgrade, but like I said, I think you could realistically just call this a change as well and not an upgrade. I don't think the difference between a Blaze Olive and Gory is absolutely massive. I would just say it's slightly in favor of Gory, and especially when you take into consideration what I think they're going to mean for the team, I think it's generally going to be a positive change. But you kind of look at the offseason and where Golden Guardians went, you maybe wanted them to do a little bit more. I think getting Huhi was great, but maybe upgrading your bot lane here would have been a lot better. If you were rocking into 2022 with something, or 2023 with something like Johnson Huhi, I think that would be an incredibly strong bot lane to add on to. Hopefully a bounce back here from River, a bounce back here from Licorice, who we know can play well. Bringing in someone like Gory, who has had success on teams in the past. I think you're really starting to look at building something there, but I think kind of the general feel around Golden Guardians is just a mediocre team, and I think that's okay. They're a low-budget team. Pretty much every team in the LCS went a little bit low-budget this year, basically with the exception of FlyQuest, and I think Golden Guardians is a good example of that. Running back a lot of the players, hoping that they kind of get back to the form that they were at before 2022, and then just adding on pieces like Huki and Gory, and hopefully having them mesh. I think it's a good idea, and I don't think Golden Guardians is a bad team by any stretch, but this is just not a team that really inspires me, and not one that I would expect to be making a massive push for like top 5, top 6 in the region. That's going to go ahead and bring us to our final 2 teams, the only 2 teams in the LCS last year that did not make the playoffs, of course, with the 8-team expanded, whatever you want to call it, playoff system that the LCS rolled out. Starting off with our number 9 team, this team was looking like number 10 for a majority of the year, but they did turn it around towards the back half, started finally playing up to their skill level, and that, of course, was Immortals. Immortals went into summer of last year actually kind of feeling themselves. They spent quite a bit of money over the mid-season break and really tried to put together a roster that was going to be able to compete. And I actually think they did that. They brought in Kenvi, they kept Power of Evil, Lost, Ignar, Revenge. Ignar was new as well. A lot of different pieces on here that I think, me included, like a lot of people expected this to work a lot better than it did, and it was not. It did not work. It was a disaster, a complete and utter disaster. They actually only end up changing 3 members, but I think it's for the best. You end up keeping your top side here, which I do kind of like. You bring Revenge back on the top side. This is someone who has grown over his time in the LCS. This was someone who was promoted pretty quickly throughout the system, a solo queue superstar for many, many years on the North American server, was given a couple of opportunities, most notably here with Immortals, and he's been fine. He's been able to take advantage of his opportunities quite a bit. Kind of the opposite of a lot of the other top laners that we've talked about throughout this episode so far, in that he is very lane dominant. He's very lane focused. He very much likes to win lane. He's not a bad team fighter by any means, but oftentimes going into the late game, whether or not he has a gold lead or not, will show you how effective he is going to be towards the back half. He ends up getting a C+ grade from me. I think some games he's going to be a lot higher because he's going to be able to take advantage of some of these weaker laners that we see in the top lane in the LCS, some of these more team fight oriented top laners, like a player like Impact, which Revenge actually played really well against last year, is kind of a great example. But on that same boat, he could also be closer to a C or a C- in some of these games, because if he doesn't win early, he does lose. He's not someone who loses all that gracefully, and so definitely more of a feast or famine player. Then you have Kenvi in the jungle. I really don't know what to say about Kenvi. I have him as a C grade here. He did not play like a C player last year. He was a D player at best last year for Immortals. I think you can make a real case that Kenvi was the worst player in the LCS last year. Obviously, one of the biggest, most hyped prospects that we've had in the LCS ecosystem in quite a long time was playing for 100 Thieves Academy for many years, was finally given a shot here on this Immortals team, and certainly did not have the rookie year that I think he wanted or expected to have, but certainly still has that prospect pedigree that I do talk about quite a bit on this channel. If you're looked at as this big can't miss prospect, I'm probably going to give you a little bit more time to figure shit out, because yes, sometimes adapting to the LCS can be hard and it takes some time, but good players can usually figure it out, right? Like, they'll usually get their wits about them. Eventually you're going to have teammates around you that are going to be able to enable you, and even then, like, you're going to be able to look good individually on some bad teams. And so I still have hope that Kenvi is going to be a productive, good LCS player, but he certainly wasn't that last year. He was a lot closer to a D. I think C is a little bit of a compromise. I think he could eventually be a B+. At some points we were thinking like an A-level player in the jungle here for any LCS team, but he's really going to have a bounce back 2023 if I feel comfortable at all putting him at all in that category. Even the B category right now just feels much too high to consider his value. He is a C player. He's been given another chance here on Immortals. Hopefully he can take advantage of it in 2023. But every other position here has been switched out. We're going to talk about mid lane first. You're going from Power of Evil in the mid lane to a Blaze Olive. I think these are two very similar players with how they played last year. Very different, play styles, but in terms of talent and value, I think they're probably right around that same level. Power of Evil, obviously a much more passive, much more support-oriented mid laner. Somebody who has, maybe been a little bit infamous, I guess is the word you would use, for being a little bit of a power farmer in lane, kind of AFK farm for 20 minutes and then go fight. He can do that sometimes, but I think he's much more effective in team fights than people give him credit for. Blaze Olive, very much not that playstyle. Very active playstyle coming out from a Blaze Olive. He's going to take a lot of risks. Some of them are going to pay off, some of them aren't, but honestly, I think this is a positive change overall for Immortals. Even if I think PoE is the better player, which I do, I think PoE is the better player. I think just having a player like ABO on the team that is willing to take more risks, especially pairing that with a player like Kenvi, where I think taking those risks and having that mechanical skill ceiling is going to be a little bit more positive overall. I think that's a good change, even if generally I think the quality of player going from PoE to ABO is a little bit of a downgrade. That's why I have this listed as a change, because I do see this as potentially a better stylistic fit for everything going on with Immortals, a team that really isn't expected to be dominant, a team that doesn't have a ridiculous amount of talent surrounding that mid lane. I think having a more aggressive mid laner is always going to be beneficial in that case, but it's certainly not an upgrade in terms of talent level, at least in my opinion. PoE has, you know, with the exception of last year, pretty consistently been a top 3 to 4 mid laner in pretty much every region that he's played in, both EU and North America, and so ABO coming in certainly has some shoes to fill, but he just has to be better than 2022 Power of Evil, which I certainly don't think is a ridiculous bar to hit, and I think he'll probably end up being better than what Power of Evil was for this team. But you've also got the bot lane, which is changing out. You had Lost and Ignar as kind of your summer split bot lane last year. I'm still a little bit in on the Lost train. I certainly think his problems last year were a little bit overhyped. I think he wasn't perfect, but he certainly wasn't a disaster like some other players were last year, and in fact, he wasn't a disaster, in my opinion, like his replacement on this team was last year in Tactical. But unlike Lost, Tactical has the pedigree in the LCS to prove that he can be a pretty top-tier LCS bot laner. He was that for Team Liquid on a lot of their Worlds runs. He replaced Doublelift. We have to remember this was somebody who was looked at as one of the best AD carries in the LCS going into last year. He just had such an abysmal season that it's really hard to kind of forget that. It's really hard to kind of separate his value from that. That's why he's all the way down to a D+ in terms of value. But if he can get even remotely back to where he was in 2020 and in 2021, I actually think this is going to be a more positive change overall for Immortals. I think that Tactical is a very talented player, and he's really smart about it too. He's not this dumb player that's going to be making a lot of mistakes early, kind of feast or famine that we see a lot of variance in from year to year. He was more so known as a very good team fighter on his Team Liquid days. He just wasn't able to kind of bring that out on the TSM days. He was losing lane way too hard. That's always been a little bit of a weakness from his game, but it was really exploitable towards the back half of the year. So it'll be interesting to see if he can really rebound that. I still think he is a good team fighter, but the weakness in lane is definitely something that he is going to have to adapt to. It's funny to see both Tactical and Kenvi here, because I think you can make a real case that they were the two most disappointing players in the LCS last year, both getting another shot here on Immortals. But bringing in a new support is definitely an intriguing decision. They bring in Fleshy here, who was in the TCL for Nasser, who I believe I'm saying that right. It's hard to know because I don't speak Turkish, and so the only broadcast is in Turkish. And I don't speak it, but Fleshy is kind of an interesting prospect, and I'm going to say this right now. I have never been wrong about a region more consistently than I've been wrong about the TCL. Quite often, I'll see TCL players coming over to NA, and I'll be like, they're okay. Like, they look like pretty good players, but not ones that I would, like, lose my mind over bringing in. I was very wrong about Closer. I was wrong on the other direction about Broken Blade, where I was like, Broken Blade's going to be a stud from day one, and he really took some time to get going. So take that with a grain of salt when I say that Fleshy is meh. Like, he really doesn't stand out to me as this super import here from Turkey. Clearly, Immortals saw something in him that they really liked, but the level of play that I was seeing out of him was just fine. I do see this as an upgrade to Ignar purely because Ignar was abysmal last year for this Immortals team. I think a lot of the blame that got put onto Lost really should have been put on Ignar and Kenvi. I think those were the two players for Immortals that really underperformed the most. And so Fleshy coming in here should be a little bit more stable, hopefully overall for this Immortals team, but I don't know. I'm really not that high on him. Hopefully I can be proven wrong. He doesn't seem to have a real concrete playstyle, and obviously, like I said for Boogie, I haven't been able to watch a ridiculous amount of games over this break. I'm going to be doing a lot more of an in-depth deep dive before we get to the power rankings, because I am going to be, of course, ranking all of these players 1 to 10 in their positions, and I want to make sure I have an accurate guide on what Fleshy is. But from what I've seen so far, he's really just a fine player. He's someone who's going to come in, probably be a lower-ish tier support in the LCS. Maybe he isn't going to be a complete disaster, but honestly, I think there's a real shot that he comes in and is the worst support in the LCS from day one, and that's definitely not something that you really want to see. Hopefully, he's going to be able to come in and play at a higher level than that, but Tactical and Fleshy as a bot lane duo is certainly not going to inspire a ton of confidence in me. You're really hoping for some bounce back players here on Immortals. You're hoping for Kenvi to really start reaching his potential. You're hoping for Tactical to get a lot closer to what he was in 2021 than what he was in 2022. You're hoping for ABO and Revenge's aggressive playstyles to really pay off and really complement a lot of these players well, and you're hoping Fleshy is a pleasant surprise for this team. That's a lot of things to hope for Immortals, and I'm just not sure I'm on the hype train of them all hitting. They're really all going to have to hit for this team to really be nearly as competitive as I think they're going to want to be, but still, some decent decisions here. Going for bounce back players that maybe you can eventually sell on next year could be a really good strategy. Let's say that someone like Tactical or Kenvi has this really big bounce back season, maybe really overperforms even if the team isn't doing well. Perhaps you can then get, $1 million buyout from one of the top teams to bring them in and give them another shot on a top team, and that's going to completely restart your financial operations here for Immortals. So, generally speaking, I like the idea of kind of bringing in the Island of Misfit Toys and then hoping to rebuild them enough to sell them on for some money so you can make the whole team better, but it's just going to be interesting, and it's a big risk to see if any of those are actually going to pay off here in 2023. Overall, like I said, the direction that Immortals is going, I can understand. I just don't think it's going to be all that conducive to success in 2023. That's going to go ahead and bring us to our 10th and final team here in my 2023 LCS roster review video. This one has been a long one, but I guess this is to make up for the lack of content that I've been posting over the past month. Of course, talking about our number 10 team, the team that finished worst in the LCS in 2022. I doubt they're going to do it in 2023 because it is Dignitas. And man, did Dignitas upgrade this offseason, or at least on paper they did. I'll go ahead and talk about some of the concerns and some of the worries that I have with this team, but overall, a lot of really, really solid improvements from this team. You're only retaining one member, quote-unquote, one member, kind of half of a member from last year, and that is Spawn in the bot lane position. Now, Spawn was a midseason call-up from Dignitas Academy. He was dominating Academy. I covered, obviously, Academy on this channel. You can go and check out those videos. I've been very high, very, very high on Spawn for quite a long time. In fact, I would consider myself one of the biggest Spawn fans in North America. He's someone who I truly do believe is a good, at the very worst, bot laner in the LCS at this level right now. I think he's very comparable, if not a little bit better, to what a player like Yon is going to be offering in the immediate short term. At an LCS level, I think it was a really smart decision to keep him in the bot lane. Something that I tweeted out at the beginning of this offseason was I was really concerned that Dignitas was going to go in this different direction. You had all these rumors coming out about the roster that they were putting together, and I was concerned that Spawn was just simply not going to be a part of that. He was going to get shoved back down to Academy, and he was going to get trapped there again, very similar to what we've seen out of players like Prismal. But he does end up maintaining his spot here in the LCS on Dignitas, and I think that's a great decision. He is a bot laner that I think is a pretty good one, probably a top 6-ish bot laner in the region, could be even higher than that if he continues to develop, and I'm really glad to see him get his shot here. But the rest of the team is a change. So let's go ahead and talk about the big upgrades first, and then we'll get into the support position. But let's talk about top lane first, because you're getting rid of Hoon, who was arguably the most overmatched player in the LCS last year. He was someone who was brought in to be an Academy player, someone who had never played at a top league level, coming out of Korea, and, just kind of got thrust into that position when Dignitas was just kind of throwing shit at the wall towards the back half of the year. Was not ready for it. They realize that, and they go in a different direction. They actually acquire Armut from Mad Lions over in the LEC, a very interesting addition here. Armut, very similar to Impact, is coming off of probably his worst year as a Major League pro here so far, and that's okay. Sometimes that happens. His over-aggression can sometimes get him in trouble. The meta really was not conducive to what Armut is very good at over the past year or so, and so I'm not going to sit here and say that I think he was perfect, but I'm also not going to sit here and say that I project him to be a disaster, the upcoming year. I actually think he's probably going to have a pretty good bounce back here on Dignitas in a similar way to where I would think that Impact would have a similar bounce back on FlyQuest. And honestly, a pretty good addition for this Dignitas team. Obviously, he didn't cost all that much money, as this entire team is probably not costing all that much money, and I think Dignitas has to feel pretty good about that, but he's going to come in be a pretty huge upgrade to Hoon immediately. Another one of the, straight swaps, and there's another one on this team that I would consider one of the biggest upgrades of the offseason is going from Hoon to Armut. Mid lane's also in that conversation. We'll get to that in a second, but Dignitas has got to be very happy to get a player like Armut in here. And then they bring in a duo that has worked together in the past year. They bring in the jungle mid of Santorin and Jensen, two very experienced LCS players. Jensen coming off of an LCS championship with Cloud9, Santorin coming off of a year where he was TL's most consistent piece over the course of the year. I feel really good about this. Honestly, I really like these additions for Dignitas. I think obviously we've heard all the rumors and all of the talks about how prices and general contracts in the LCS and in the LEC, but mostly in the LCS, have gone down considerably over the past offseason, and I think Dignitas is a team that really benefited from that. This is, there are a few players on this team that I don't think they would have been able to afford all that regularly if their prices were what they were last year, but coming into this year, they're able to build this intriguing roster, and they do a really good job of acquiring veteran talent that has worked together with Santorin and Jensen. Santorin, I'm a huge fan of. I've been a huge fan of Santorin for many years. This was someone who obviously was really, really good on FlyQuest a couple of years ago. Kind of transitioned that into ups and downs on TL, but in my opinion, mostly ups on TL. He was one of the more, if not the most consistent member of that Team Liquid team, even if he wasn't the carry every single game. I think you can make a real case that he was the most important player to Team Liquid over the past year or so. Jensen obviously coming off of a LCS title win, which is absolutely huge here. Even if I am a little bit lower on Jensen as a player and what he offers in 2022 and 2023, as opposed to some of the other players in the league, I still think he is a massive upgrade to what Blue was offering you last year, which was taking up an import slot and arguably being one of the worst mids in the league. And so Jensen's obviously going to be huge for that. His playstyle, though, is going to be interesting to see how they adapt to this. I'll talk about this a bit later, but Jensen, a much more passive player, definitely somebody who has thrived a lot more on these control mages, more supportive type mid laners. We talked about that in the Cloud9 section. Things like the Zillion, things like the Orianna, things like the Anivia come to mind as kind of the picks that he's really liked pulling out in recent years. Pairing that with a more passive, supportive jungler here in Santorin, it's not like he's a super resource-heavy, carry-oriented jungler. He's another enable kind of player, enabler. And then Spawn, is he really the one you want to be investing a lot of resources into? It's certainly an interesting team dynamic. I'm not going to say it's similar to what Team Liquid was last year, but we kind of saw what happened when you put a lot of players who never really played for themselves in their career on one team, and the resources kind of just got dropped. I'm not going to say that's going to happen here with Dignitas, but it's certainly something that's on the mind, purely from a player standpoint. I mean, going from a 3-15 record to going Armut, Santorin, Jensen as your top side is an absolute huge win for this Dignitas team, and you got to feel really good about that. And then at the support position, the final player we get to talk about is Ignar here, and he's probably the most intriguing one, and maybe the player that is going to matter the most in terms of how this team actually ends up performing, because this is the only player on the team that I actually have as a downgrade from last year. Ignar versus Biofrost, if you're just comparing their 2022s, Biofrost was leaps and bounds better than what Ignar was offering. Ignar was very poor on Immortals, and Biofrost, I think you could argue, was the best part of Dignitas last year. It's interesting that they would go in this direction. I actually think Biofrost on this team would be very interesting. He's played, I believe, with Santorin before. That might be wrong. I don't exactly remember when Santorin left TSM. Actually, there's no shot. He must have played with Svenskeren instead. But, it's not like these players haven't been playing long enough and they probably know each other, right? So it's interesting to see them bring in Ignar. Clearly, they want to go for this more aggressive, more engage-oriented playstyle. Biofrost, much more comfortable, in my opinion, on the Enchanters. I actually thought the meta last year fit him relatively well. Ignar, much more of an engage-style player in that respect, and so maybe it was just a stylistic approach that they wanted to go for a little bit more aggression early on in games, and even late games and teamfights, later in games and teamfights, I should say. Ignar definitely offers something different than what Biofrost offers. I'm just not exactly sure that is going to be better for this team overall. It's certainly a wait-and-see approach. We'll see. If Ignar is 2022 Ignar, it's not going to look all that good, but Dignitas clearly had a plan going into the offseason. We've seen Ignar be a super positive piece on teams before. He's obviously worked with Santorin in the past on FlyQuest. The synergy there could be important, but again, it's all going to be on Spawn and Ignar as kind of that duo in the bot lane to see if they can really hold up. Now, if they're one of the middle-tier bot lanes on this Dignitas team, I think they're going to be sitting relatively okay. If they're not, if they're one of the lower-tier bot lanes, I think this team could be in a little bit of a trouble. But looking at the outlook overall for Dignitas, you have to give them credit because they at least went out and tried. This is an organization that I think a lot of people, me included, have been ragging on over the past few years for just not putting in the effort to really even attempt to be a top 6 team in the league. But this year, they're definitely going for it. They're, bringing in Santorum, bringing in Jensen, bringing in Arma, bringing in Ignar. These are names that casual LCS fans will know. Obviously, you've got you got a prospect here in Spawn, and you've still got a pretty good academy system. Hopefully, you can bring back players like XU to be a part of that, because I do like the, prospects of XU moving into the future. But Dignitas overall in a much better spot than normal. Now, is this team going to be closer to 2020 FlyQuest, or are they going to be closer to 2021 CLG? I think they've got a little bit of both of them in them. That 2020 FlyQuest team that not a lot of people saw coming. Obviously, a lot of veteran players that have played together before. Really, everything clicked for them, and they were able to unlock a lot. 2021 CLG looked very similar. A lot of veteran players that had, played together before, a lot of synergy between them, and they just completely fumbled. They were never really able to get on the same page, and none of them were really able to grow throughout the year. I think Dignitas is probably going to fall somewhere in between. I don't really see this being a top, 2 or 3 team in the league. I also don't really see this being a bottom, 2 or 3 team in the league like Dignitas has been pretty consistently, like that CLG team has been consistently. But if they were somewhere there, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. I don't know if their upside is ever going to be like top 2, but maybe if absolutely everything goes right. Either way, if this team is able to even sniff like top 5, top 6 in the league, that's got to be a huge, huge win for this Dignitas organization that over the past few years has just really never even been in that conversation. All right, but that is going to do it. You guys get an hour and 45 minutes of LCS roster reviews and discussion. I do really hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. Of course, if you are new, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. If you like the way I talk about all these teams, go super in-depth, talk about them from every aspect that you could basically talk about them. You're going to love when I do that about the LEC. You're going to love when I do that about the LCK and when I do that about the LPL. So if you guys are interested in that, hit the subscribe button. Those videos are going to be coming out as the offseason moves along, as those rosters get a little bit more solidified on the eastern side. LEC, obviously, coming out later this week. Hope you guys are excited for that, especially if you enjoyed this. But let me know down in the comment section, of course, below what you guys thought about this video and what you guys think about the LCS going into 2023. Do you have different thoughts from mine? Do you think some upgrades or downgrades I got wrong in this video? Of course, let me know all of that down in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.